Okay, thank you for this presentation. Now we're going to pass the talk to the audience. Do you have a? I guess you have many questions. I have one question actually. As you know, I work on health, and I'm very interested in comparing the way health is governed with the way with what you presented. We know that the cities are the one who are in charge of health control governance. And I can see, for example, I know in Surat, I could see that you have a good, let's say, governance of the diseases, precisely because they dealt with the epidemic of plagues 15 years ago, and it's completely changed the way the city was organized. So, first question is: do you think that it helped in dealing with coping with this issue of climate change? Second question is that for sanitation we have there is a huge program here at CPR. Sanitation is as well dealt at another level. In my opinion, I'm not an expert. It's more a state level problematic. What, in my opinion, it should be dealt at the level of municipalities, and it's not. At least, in my opinion, it's not done at all. So why, how this climate change became a concern of municipalities and not other issue, for example?
Véronique Dupont from the Institute of Research for Sustainable Development, Paris, and affiliated here. As you mentioned, I mean, at the city level, I mean, the city has multiple objectives, and then you can highlight contradictory objectives. So I wanted to know how the city will deal with that. Just one example on the environmental, I mean, in the environmental category, you have reduced energy demand and social package. You have provide energy access to most of the people. So at one level, these two are maybe contradictory. So I think this is what the most challenging thing I think in this governance form.
Thank you. A very interesting presentation. I just had two questions. Firstly, I think you said 70% of cities in the 2015 study you cited showed no evidence of awareness of climate change in their plans. Doesn't particularly surprise me, I think, particularly when you look at the range of cities, many are small, and compared with state governments, for example, I would imagine you've got the state action plans are mandated. It's very different. I just wanted to know if you had any sense of the cities which did and didn't show, what was the distinguishing feature? Particularly, was there any role played by external actors in the ones, either whether it's the state government, central government through schemes, or international agencies? And second question is, did you see any cases where cities actually, because I imagine capacity is also an issue, had access or used any particular analytical tools, decision tools, climate risk assessments, and so on? Thank you.
Okay. So on health and diseases, that's probably one of the most important co-benefits that I actually didn't explore in more detail. You're absolutely right. The planning post-plague was actually the main reason that the Seward municipal government actually wanted these people in the city, because they were thinking that this is a good way to think about these broader health issues. Also the heat action plan in Ahmedabad involved the PHFI, which is the Public Health Foundation of India, because heat has such a impact on absolutely. So
it was just after the extreme heat events, particularly the summer before, which had been sort of, it had the highest temperatures in the last decade. So there was a sort of motivation and an entry point that was quite aside from climate change. It was sort of just the city saying that we can use these events as a way to bring in actors, funds, and broaden responsibility to some extent and achieve outcomes that also help these other benefits.
Yeah. So one thing I want to kind of, I guess it's been the subtext of this, is that climate change and resilience have been kind of these flexible terms that then cities have taken and owned, right? And I think it's something that isn't imposed from top down, which I think is a criticism of it, but really are kind of localized in very specific ways through negotiation. On your question of sanitation, there's an entire bit that I actually didn't include specifically on waste to energy in Rajkot. So they're thinking of kind of segregating the waste and creating a waste to energy, and they've been trying to do this for the past 15 years, and it's failed because of multiple corruption-based scandals, because waste to energy is a big contract. So there were all these. Sanitation is a particularly complex challenge in and itself, and climate change gives the added dimension of the fact that, you know, managing it leads to emissions in very particular ways, like methane emissions in landfills, landfill burning, and also kind of waste to energy, if you have that as a plant, right? So, but I believe there's a waste to energy strategy being mooted at some point. We don't know if it'll come out. Veronique, you really caught what we were trying to do with this, in the sense that we're exactly, the subtext of that was that we were exactly trying to show that contradictions do exist. So right now, you know, because we were presenting this to the city government, a lot of the times we wanted to kind of show the synergies, right? So kind of, can you incentivize action with the synergies between your incentives and climate change? But absolutely, trade-offs are present here. We had a very interesting, our first meeting with the municipal commissioner. I came in there with a slide deck with this kind of matrix, and I was like, you know, city needs to explore synergies and trade-offs. And he just said, let me stop you there. I'm not interested in trade-offs. So at that point, we started moving away from the language of trade-offs, trying to just think of synergies just to when speaking to them. But I think highlighting, you know, your specific question on how this can be used to explore trade-offs, I think is a very valuable insight. Specifically, energy access and reduce energy demand, your question, I think the city is thinking of it together in the affordable housing project. I think when they think about solar at the particular daytime, they're actively thinking about how solar panels on the rooftop can be used for locally. You know, other contradictions and trade-offs that exist are actually affordability of housing and transport access. So the city, right, built these affordable housing blocks quite far out. And from our own fieldwork in the sites, people weren't able to get to school. We're dropping out of school because only one bus came in the morning. There were no autos, right? So there's this kind of trade-off where if you want to build affordable housing, it has to be kind of far away, but you also need to back it up with transport. Therefore, we kind of made this triangle here. I know it's not that much of a radical triangle, but it's a little thing where you kind of say that, look, if you're going to build affordable housing, we have to think about it in terms of transport access as well. So thank you for that. On your question, you know, I think you're absolutely right. There's no mandate at the city level, and I think that's something I didn't stress enough. While at the national level, you know, states are supposed to create state action plans, and there's a national action plan on climate change as well. You know, I can't really comment on that study specifically, but what I can tell you was that Rajkot really didn't perform well in that study. So that study, I have my own criticism of it in the sense that it didn't really dive into all the different plans. It kind of took the main master plan of the city, which is designed by the local planning authority, which might not necessarily have the most incentives to think about climate change. While someone like the municipal corporation that's handling a few more energy-related things, more about the housing, does have those incentives. So I think that if you did do that analysis again on this date with all the different schemes like we've done for Rajkot, I think you would find a lot more awareness in that particular sense. I do think, and that's why I put the external actors up front, that the external actors have brought the language of climate change, have brought the language of resilience into these cities. But the projects by which all this is being done, I think were there before. So what I mean by that is that the municipal corporation was already thinking about waste to energy, and then that project was kind of reframed as a, you know, climate change project as well, just to get more funding or to get more capacity or to get more insights. On your analytical tools questions, it's something that we've been struggling for quite some time, because we've been actually pushing a more sophisticated version of this as a, you know, analytical tool that cities can use. Unfortunately, decision making doesn't happen at that level yet. So when I show this to anyone at the city level, no one actually thinks across these objectives, right? So the affordable housing bit is handled by the housing department, the transport access is handled by the transport department, the energy demand is handled by the state utility, not even the municipal commissioner, but the state utility or your local energy department, right? And the financial is on the financial department. So when I bring this matrix, it's kind of like, this is not relevant to me. I have to handle this small bit of it. When I bring it to the commissioner, it's almost like, give us implementable projects, right? So there's this kind of, and something that we haven't talked about here, that there hasn't really been an institutionalization of climate change, of thinking across these various objectives and how climate change fits into them in cities. That's something that we want to build out in the future.
Ben, yes? Or please, okay.
Yeah. That's a great presentation. My name is Anuradha. I work as a consultant. I, by and large, work with donors in different regions of the world. I think it's amazing to see something categorically being said with reference to a case study, but please take this only as a suggestion. Maybe you have answers which may fall in your remaining work. I see this matrix to be, giving a lot of information in layers. For some of us who do a lot of systematic reviews and evidence summaries, you can look at this as adaptive approaches which cities hitherto need to do, or perhaps interventions, in terms of enhancing the climate change mitigation process. But some way, did you think of, weighing them into, low, medium, and high, because all of them are of different degrees, and I think that would help you kind of, put in layers as to which of them contribute majorly towards a particular, thing. It's a supplementary thing is that I don't know if you looked at any particular. There are a lot of systematic reviews which has been done in climate change planning process, climate change adaptation process, in terms of interventions and the impact that it creates. Did you try to make a correlation? Because this is just amazing. This is like spellbound. I think some references to that and say this is explicit in this case, that would make it just,
Can I just clarify the question before we get other ones? Is it about the impact of the different schemes?
Like in a systematic review, the different interventions, these are primarily related to two parameters as I see, access and quality. So when you see access and quality across lower middle income countries across the globe, systematic reviews are normally done in a country specific scenarios globally. So there are specific interventions which would have directly impacted, and those would be a constant. And this can be a case study to explain, see, this is a globally established standard which is also explicit in a Rajkot case study. Did you try to make some comparisons of what has already been established? And therefore, trying to illustrate this case example would make it like a more international model to say, look, we have, you've done it, I know, but then it's always great to see this kind of fieldwork, because this is what the case study which makes it the most exemplary thing. It's not even a question, I'm just adding to your great work that you've done.
Yeah, thanks very much for the presentation. It's very interesting. I have a few questions. And one remark, since you've started working in Coimbatore, I just want to know whether you're seeing the same kind of, let's say, appropriation of the municipal corporation, because Gujarat had the tradition, of course, of very strong municipalities. So in a way, your case is a specific case in the story of Indian municipalities. So just that. I was also surprised because you speak of smart city in the past tense. And in fact, smart city has hardly started. So it brings me to the question of, in terms of one way to institutionalize is, of course, to maybe, I don't know the term in English, but bilan carbon. I mean, to measure your carbon emissions on a regular basis. So all these kinds of experimental projects, do they make sense at the level of the city in terms of emission measurement? And have they started to think of measuring, and do we see that adding all these projects lead or not to better emission, CO2 emission framework? Yeah, I'm interested, but this is my own interest. You started with the mayor, but you talked finally a lot about the municipal commissioner. So I want to know what is the relationship between the mayor and the commissioner, and more generally, between the political and the technocratic wing, and of course ICLEI, because why did ICLEI choose Rajkot, and how is the existing setup sustainable in the long term, which is the only way that you can have a long-term climate change action. And another question, sorry, a lot of them, but they are short. I'm very interested in your story of local entrepreneurs. I want to know whether these local entrepreneurs, yeah, no, they start to put this solar panel, there's a business, there's a market. So it's very market-based anyway, solutions in some ways. And whether these entrepreneurs are themselves also involved now in expanding their market and therefore playing a role, international donors will go to cities and say, okay, do climate change, but maybe these are the guys who are actually going to implement it. So did you look at it or not? Is it interesting to look at that? There's another one somewhere, but I can't read it. I can't read it.
Maybe you can answer this before all guys ask.
Last round.
Thank you for that comment. I think it's actually quite relevant because it's something that we've been struggling with when we presented this iteration of this work at a global conference, where there was little sense of, is this an increment? Is this, already happening? Is this something that cities have been doing for some time that it hasn't been documented in this way? And I think something that also that you were saying about, what are the metrics of each of these? Like, what are the carbon savings, or what are the vulnerabilities? And I think that comment/criticism extremely on board, and I think hopefully we'll be doing that kind of analysis. As you all know, data is extremely hard to come by. Just another side story on carbon accounting. So ICLEI actually does carbon accounting for all its cities. And honestly, it's what half these guys do. They run around state departments, they run around municipal corporation departments, and get all the data for electricity usage, and we've been doing independently getting data from the utilities on electricity usage, and I can tell you it's quite difficult to, but I know they have institutional buy-in, but data is itself an issue in Indian cities, and it's hard to kind of create a standardized element of carbon accounting that cities. But ICLEI, for that reason, are doing quite good work. On the smart city, the reason why I said it in the past tense was because it was slightly more about the proposal making process. So, for those of you who don't know, I did some work in my previous workplace on Smart Cities mission, analyzing what the proposals look like. And what we were trying to get a sense of was that it seemed to be one of the first times that Indian cities had really deliberated through all the different sectors together. And from your comment on Coimbatore, I can specifically bring insight from there, where climate change is not being thought about absolutely in the same way. It doesn't have that same level of state involvement and state kind of push, but it is being thought of in the context of the city's own environmental problems. So as you might know, Coimbatore Smart City mission is based around its lakes. It's based around restoring these lakes to make them as places of water security and also as places of storm drainage. So actually, we'll be getting a policy brief on Coimbatore in 2 weeks, so look out. But what we specifically we explore in that policy brief is that the objectives of water security and stormwater management are at times conflicting, right? So if you have a reservoir built for water security, it's full, at times of dry months. Then you have a flash flood, the stormwater runoff just flows over the lake, right? So while if you have one built for stormwater security, you need to have empty reservoirs, which are not water secure, right? So these things have been outlined in the Smart City mission as saying that these are systems to handle both stormwater and water and reservoirs, but hasn't been thought of together in that particular way, right? So again, using the multi-objective, we highlight that there are multiple objectives the city has, and that perhaps these are conflicting a bit more, right? So this is something that we bring out a lot more in the Coimbatore case, because I think they're less hesitant in the word trade-offs. On the mayor and municipal commissioner, it's a fascinating, I think, I have quite a few observations. I'm not sure how many I'm able to say, but I think the first thing is that it probably would have been the municipal commissioner sitting on that global covenant if it wasn't for, particular political win that you would get from being on such a political board, a global board, right? So I think the visibility factor is something that mayors take on. That said, from my own experience, there did not seem to be that much rift, and correct me if I'm wrong, that much rift between the mayoral office and the municipal commissioner office. I was talking to the secretary of the urban development department in Gandhinagar, in Gujarat, at the state level, and I was kind of asking him, what's your position on cities? What's your sense of the relationship between mayors and the municipal commissioner? And his kind of take on it was that in Gujarat, that's not an issue. So you're coming from a separate state. It's not an issue here because we have alignment across the national, state, and local governments, and our bureaucratic cadre has bought into the Gujarat state model, and therefore it's all good, right? So he also explicitly, then I asked him, okay, so why isn't the state have a more heavy hand? And he said that we actually trusted the cities to do their job. And that's actually another reason why Rajkot perhaps can do all these different projects, because there is a certain level of devolution, and there are historical reasons for that as well, but there was a certain level of devolution and trust because of that alignment of political parties. I perhaps haven't answered your question, but there wasn't a case perhaps of standing committee rift that you normally see in other corporations in the time that I was there. What I did see a lot was a lot of municipal worker activism. So around issues of waste, around issues of, there's a project now to kind of track the biometrics of different sweepers. There were a lot of protests quite often in the municipal office, and that was the kind of main actor that was pushing back on some of these things. Waste particularly, I think, is a big story that I haven't brought out here, and I think if we ever go back to Rajkot, that would be what I would want to explore a bit more, where there were kind of a couple of constituencies with different objectives, right? So there were the waste workers, there was a municipal corporation that wanted to make Swachh Bharat like their big thing electorally. This was also, by the way, all to lead up to the election, right? So they wanted these kind of quick win projects. And also there were these kind of organizations and private companies that had no experience of waste management, but were being given contracts, right? And so there were a couple of things happening there. And actually Rajkot has a very good set of waste activists, if anybody wants to get in touch with them. I'm happy to put you in touch. Lastly, on ICLE, and this is something that we've been reflecting quite a bit, it does say something of having a person that's trained in energy and trained in carbon accounting to be sitting right next to the commissioner's office. I think that perhaps there were no institutionalized roots of influence, but in many ways, as I reflected, as you know, municipal commissioner reflected, that ICLE has been the energy department for quite some time. So even in the smart city proposal, so those that are unfamiliar, Rajkot wasn't chosen as a smart city to quite economy for quite some time. It was only came in the third round, about a year in, right? And when I would go to the cities, the ICLE department was working on the smart city project, because they were just an extra pair of hands with a computer that could run some Excel sheets or do something or write a paragraph in English, right? And so in some ways, this was also a way that kind of climate change, because ICLE would then do their own institutional thing and put in climate change into these plans. And that's perhaps how these plans were aware of climate change, right? Where the actors were kind of given bits and pieces. We've also been peripherally involved with the Coimbatore Action Plan on this. And, organizations are kind of given chapters. So, for example, IIHS is given the chapter on migration to write, right? So Coimbatore's Climate Action Plan has bits and pieces written by CPR, ICLE, IIHS, the municipal commissioner, municipal corporation, etc. So they're kind of not perhaps institutionally directed, but have these kind of bits and elements to it. On your question on social entrepreneurs, this is something that I personally find fascinating, because I think it's about the reorganization of the political economy to an extra incentive, which is climate change. I can reflect on it perhaps in a tangential way. The first would be real estate developers have kind of taken on this greenness in Rajkot as something that they can push forward. Secondly, I also think the head of the housing department, she's an entrepreneur. She was definitely using her resources and her expertise in a way to generate housing that was better than the private sector. It was built by the government, but these houses are far, far better quality than the private sector houses that are right next door, right? And the last thing is that we are doing some independent work in the housing on energy, but there are also entrepreneurs that are kind of adapting those buildings to water stresses, right? So kind of ones that collectively purchase pumps for the building and then use it as a way to kind of store water and then pump up water, right? So, there are small things happening where they're kind of adapting to environment. That is kind of not just the Jugaad story, but I think it has to do with kind of one's own infrastructure's relationship to the environment and how climate change affects that. I'm sure these people are not using the word climate change, but it's definitely something that is perhaps will intensify as climate change intensifies.
Thank you, Olga, and then.
Hello, my name is Olga. I'm an international consultant on climate resilient urban development in Asian cities. I have three sets of questions for you. So the first one is, in the course of your work, have you explored the connection, or rather the mainstreaming of climate change into land use regulations of cities? The reason why I ask this is because the way cities tend to develop, and that's not only specific to India, that's pretty much what we see in Asia, they tend to develop in disregard of the natural conditions. And then we need engineering solutions to actually address what we have created. For example, we will build in low-lying areas, we will dry water bodies, and then as a result, obviously, when the flood comes, for example, then we are not able to handle that excess of water because the natural system has been destroyed. So I feel that issue is extremely important if we want to build resilient cities. And I'd like to get your insights, please, on what is happening in India in this respect. My second question is on the smart cities mission. I did a small research on it just very recently, and I haven't come across any special provision for climate change in the Smart Cities mission. I would like to know whether in the next phase, which is supposed to come in a couple of years, I think, are there some learnings from the cities that deliberately wanted to mainstream climate change, and are the rules, the guidelines going to change so that that has to be more kind of a business as usual thing for the Smart Cities mission? And then my third question is on the low housing project that you have presented. So I found it quite interesting, and I'd like to learn a little more on a number of things. Like one is how did this come up? Was there any public consultation to see what kind of housing would fit the people? Who was the designer? How did they come up with this specific design? In fact, a few elements were incorporated, which also make me think of heritage tradition on harnessing on passive energy and how exactly this came into being. I'd like to learn a little more. I'm quite interested in this idea of high density, low rise. I was just recently speaking with Ashok Lal, who's a big kind of promoter of this idea. And he was telling me that he is now trying to make an argument for developers that actually money lies into this kind of housing because rich people, their housing has been addressed, but then there is all this like low middle income, that can be potential clients. So if you can elaborate on this, that's something that I'm extremely interested in. And maybe last aspect of this is the aesthetic component of this project. I understood you said it's going to be spread out, this kind of design, and new houses are going to be built. Is there any consideration for the aesthetics, or is this not at all a concern and they're just going to reproduce exactly the same house? Thanks.
Maybe we take,
You can take a couple.
Hello, my name's, is it on? Yeah. Okay. Hi, my name's Thomas Tanner. I'm from the Overseas Development Institute. I'm interested, I guess, in the resilience and the adaptation side, and so a lot of the resilience angle seems to be quite incidental, if you like. So it's good water management because that's good for energy efficiency, but you also have a resilience gain. I'm interested in particular to know, is there an awareness or any building in of future climate change? So this idea of a shift, and is that pushing some of the projects certain ways or making them priorities, or is that still an awareness that's yet to come, next level?
Okay. On land use regulation, this is governed by the Gujarat town planning policy. So when I went and talked to the town planning officials in the city, and I asked them, are you thinking about climate change? Are you thinking about, just density? I honestly had a conversation around 12-meter roads and 20-feet roads and having to have one primary school per TP scheme and town planning scheme, etc. Right? So I think that town planning departments and policies themselves haven't caught up. Specifically on land use, I can reflect on Coimbatore a bit more, where the urban sprawl in Coimbatore is such that it's now spilling into the Nilgiris, the Western Ghats. And now urban development is actually intersecting with elephant migration pathways, right? To the point where you're actually seeing a lot more stampede deaths in the city's periphery, right? So perhaps they're not thinking of it in terms of climate change, but definitely the environment-urban intersection there is being thought of a bit more. Though, I think that the word that seems to be coming up in different land use plans is transit-oriented development. That seems to be coming out quite often, that cities seem to be pushing, at least in abstract. Yeah. It hasn't really translated to built form on the ground yet.
National policy now.
Huh?
TOD is a national
TOD,
policy.
exactly, yeah, exactly. It's a national policy of TOD, exactly. On regards to the Smart City mission and the special provision for climate change, as I argued, I think that there was no perhaps ministerial incentive to include the term climate change in the guidelines. But I think I will push back on the criticism that the scheme is not climate-oriented. I think there's enough in there about non-motorized transport, about green buildings, about solar, that there is some kind of at least technological awareness about climate change, perhaps not strategically around land use, as you were pointing out before. On the public consultation of the housing, none to my own understanding. As I was pointing out, a lot of this came out of the design of the engineer. It came out because of consultation with its sister cities. It came out in consultation because with international agencies such as SDC, but also local architects. You know, Ashok Lal has been involved in Rajkot for some time, so perhaps that seed also went to this design as well. On aesthetics, I'm not sure if that really fits in yet. Maybe, perhaps these buildings are beautiful for them. I don't know, so I'm not the best person to ask about that. On your next question, which I think is fantastic, you're absolutely right that there hasn't been kind of sustained thinking about the future impact of climate change on the cities themselves. The reasons for these are multiple. One is that the models themselves aren't low resolution enough. So while in Kochi you had very specific you know, sea level rise areas that they were mapping because of quite sophisticated institutions that existed in that city. That kind of capacity is not there in Rajkot currently. That said, though, you know, I guess it's two schools of thought, right? So are you building for the future, which obviously you should, but also development itself being the first kind of barrier towards adaptation. So in the sense that, you know, actually standard storm drainage is far better than the system that currently exists, right? Standard water supply, standard you know, sewage treatment networks, standard shelter, at least designed in a particular way, is far better. So I think that's where the cities are at right now in the developmental stage. I do think some cities are taking that a bit further, right? So they're thinking about broader 20, 30 scale impacts. I, again, you know, have been posing this question for quite some time, like, why don't we think about 2040 and where the city that will be? Unfortunately, the institutional incentives are not there. The municipal commissioner is there for 3 years. And his kind of argument is, at times, is that, you know, if we are on the right pathway, we'll reach where we have to be. I mean, I asked this question to him publicly, and that's what his response was. So I just don't think that there are enough institutional incentives to think about that long term, about urban growth and resilience. But I think it's a fantastic thing that we should start doing.
Do we have more questions? Because I want to say a few things in closing, but if there are other questions, maybe we should take those first.
No, I think you have not answered my Rajkot's question in the sense that as of now there's been no accounting of carbon emission. Do we know if it's reduced, how much it's increased, if it has increased less than the expected increase without this? Maybe it doesn't exist. So
well,
I know data is difficult, but just to have an idea of the trajectory.
So ITLAI did do a greenhouse gas accounting for the city of Rajkot, and they had a baseline, and then beyond that they did scenario projections and see where there is. I'm not sure how much I trust that data actually. I mean, that's the other problem. Even when these accountings exist, is that something that we take as, you know, at face value, or do we really, we're not sure what the methodology is by which that data was put together in terms of actually planning strategically by using those scenarios and the, you know, the sort of baseline data behind that. That kind of work does not happen. So there's a report that exists that ITLAI made, you know, that has this greenhouse gas accounting across different sectors. Then there was an update of it, and some of that is submitted to sort of, you know, like it ties into what the greenhouse gas accounting is for the country, but it isn't something necessarily that we could say is leading to a kind of informed decision making that is strategic.
I mean, a small thing about the accounting, according to ITLAI, the per capita emissions in Rajkot are less than the national average, which I don't think is particularly possible, right? I mean, urban areas do concentrate emissions. So there's something
national average,
of the Indian national average.
like including rural.
Yeah, yeah. So there's something going on with accounting that's just, I mean, India has multiple carbon accounting methods. That's a paper in itself. Which I don't think that cities themselves have sophisticated enough instruments to align themselves to that, unfortunately. Yeah. Yeah, sorry.
You sort of talked about this Rajkot housing project as being something that was a pre-election thing, etc. I mean, my question was really, what is the city's own opinion of this project, and do they see it as a quote-unquote model, which is like the big terminology in government sectors, and does that model mean more PMAY-like stuff in Rajkot? Does it mean it's inspiring private sector developers to think differently, sort of relating to Olga's question, and does it mean because Gujarat obviously learns a lot from each other's cities. So, I mean, do you have any sense of what's happening post the implementation of the project?
Yeah, so as I said, at the city level, these guidelines are, I think, going to be ramped up even more for the next phase of projects. I wish I had more pictures, but you know, what I also wanted to show is that a lot of these buildings, if you go to the sites, the private developer is actually replicating a lot of these things right next door, right? So the private developers are building these buildings that look very similar to this government-built housing. So I think there is a bit of kind of seeding and a viralness to that design idea. Perhaps aesthetics is the reason. I don't think that they're specifically thinking about climate change, but there's something going on there. On the model, that's actually a good question. I can actually ask. I didn't ask if she thinks of this as a model. I think in their office they do think of that as a model. And she's the kind of person that tours India and shows her slides, right? So she has a slide deck that she keeps sending around.
It will get picked up.
Yeah, it will.
I mean, there's a definite pride in the fact that this got the Smart Cut Award and that it, you know, it has a HUDCO award. It is shown around. The commissioner is aware of it. I've heard him sort of, you know, discuss it at other meetings. So it is a symbol of pride. I think it's a good thing, and they want to do more, and they want more visibility. I think that one of the things about the Rajkot Municipal Commission is that they, you know, they're forward-looking, and they appreciate the praise, and they want to do more to get more praise, right? So there are a lot of the actions often are driven by that.
So just one small thing on that. I was part of this roundtable on sustainable affordable housing over the last couple of months. And the city that came out most often, mostly because it was me and Ashok Lal in the room and we were quite loud, was Rajkot, right? So Rajkot was, examples of Rajkot kept coming up, that these design typologies, these kind of projects, these kinds of initiatives should be a kind of national model for other housing projects. And hopefully maybe that will be the case. We'll see.
Yeah, so I just, you know, I know we're running out of time, and the three things I want to say, just reflecting on this this conversation. One is just this idea of multiple objectives and the framework that we have up here on the board. And this is work that we've been doing in the national context and in the city context. And where it comes from is to say that, look, climate change is not going to be the primary driver in developing countries. I mean, that's, you know, it's pretty intuitive. But there are usually many other objectives, and what climate change does is it acts as a sort of stressor or a forcer on all of these different objectives. It's pretty democratic in the different priorities that it impacts. And so whatever level of decision making you're at, so in this case, if we're at the city, there are different objectives that the city has, and when we go and speak to, say, one line ministry, that person is only in, you know, they only care about housing. You go and speak to the city energy engineer, she's only sort of, say, concerned about building affordable homes or reducing energy demand. But when we put something like this up there, suddenly we have the interest of everybody in their room, because they can find their niche, their column that matters to them, right? Now, just on your question on sort of, you know, the analytical method that we're using, this is just the first stage of that. What it actually requires us to do, and which we could not do in Rajkot for a variety of reasons, A, primarily being data, and B, sort of, you know, having the political will to do it, is that the method, and it uses multi-criteria decision analysis, but sort of more simply, what it does is it allows you to say, okay, qualitatively and quantitatively, how do these different objectives do? And if I have a certain set of policies that I want to put in place, how does that policy do across these different objectives, right? And then make a decision where you're actually transparent about what you are going to give up and what you're going to get some synergies on. And Veronique, to your point, of course it's simple when you have synergies. It makes it, you know, it's good for everybody. It tells a nice story. But the real issue is that, you know, what do you do when there are trade-offs, right? And then there are always trade-offs. And what we've been doing so far is that the trade-offs are implicit. The decision maker decides this is a priority. I'm going to let this issue go because I want to gain on another issue, right? So I'm going to let the environmental sort of damage of private vehicles go because I want more sort of cars on the road, and it signals growth. And this is something that is done implicitly within an office. What we're pushing for is to say that, is there a way in which we can make that decision making more transparent? Is there a way in which we can make that analysis more transparent, where you can measure what the trade-offs are and what the synergies are, and have that be the basis by which cities decide what policies they pursue and don't pursue. So we have some sort of theoretical results around this, but when we started this work, we thought that, we're going to arrive at this decision with Rajkot, but of course it's not so simple. A, like I was saying, the data doesn't exist, and B, it's very hard to be able to do that type of work, because what it needs is for everybody to be in the room who handles each of these different objectives or these different ministries. And that takes me to my second point, which is that kind of strategic thinking isn't happening in the city. So while we have some great examples here, they're innovative, they're exciting, the question still remains that does this all add up? And I think to that, we don't have that much to say, because it may add up, it may not, but what it would require is a level of institutionalization and a level of strategic thinking where somebody high enough at the city level says that it's important for us to be able to mainstream thinking about all of these different objectives, making decisions that will have synergies, making decisions that will have trade-offs, but doing it in an informed manner, and being able to tie that into some sort of national narrative of climate change. And that is something we're not at. We're not at that stage. And then my third point is just to say that the time window is short, right? So if we're talking about, like the way Ankit started his presentation, which is to say that you're talking about 10, 20 years where, 70% of your buildings are going to be built, then that decision about where my public transportation will be, where my affordable housing is going to be made. And once that's made, reversing it is, it's locked in. It's very hard to do. So in a way, the challenge is that can we scale up enough? Can we make it add up in the small window of opportunity that there is? And I think that remains for us to be, for us to figure out. And what we've tried to do is sort of say, okay, this is a synthesis of everything that's out there. This is how we can try and make sense of it. These are the trends that we see. But there is a lot that is left to be undone, and there are ways in which that mainstreaming of climate action can happen in cities. We're not necessarily there yet.
Okay, thank you so much, Ankit and Alika, for your participation. It was very interesting, and I think it kind of echoes all the research we do, whether it is from sanitation or air studies. The good thing with this climate change is that it's a positive action for cities. And the feeling when you come to governance of the disease is very important. All this doesn't, it's not very negative. I think we have negative stories. Yeah.
And the question is whether the city is the right city.
Yeah, as well. Yeah, that's very interesting in sanitation. That's true. Yeah, thank you so much.